Well, I'm back, which means only one thing. We have another episode that has been cleared for public release. Just barely cleared, but cleared, which means against all odds, we were successful and got this episode cleared. And when I say cleared, what I really mean is that it survived. Barely, like by one signature, one distracted reviewer, and a very generous interpretation of, this seems fine. Okay, so moving on, let me describe a very, very familiar moment for you. You're sitting at your desk. It's a perfectly normal afternoon. Maybe you're reviewing a subcontract file. Maybe you're reading a clause. Maybe you're enjoying that rare moment when your inbox has temporarily stopped. And then your phone rings. Or a calendar invite appears. Or someone from the program management walks into your office with that particular look on their face. You know the look. It's the look that says, we've already promised something, and now we need contracts to get involved. And somewhere in the background, you can hear the faint sound of a bus engine starting. Not because you've worked in government contracting a long time. You know exactly what's about to happen. Contracts is about to get looped in. And that bus? Remember that bus engine we just heard starting up? It's coming. Fast. Welcome to the GovCon show.
This broadcast has been cleared for public release, but just barely.
Broadcasting from deep inside the Federal Acquisition Labyrinth, this is the GovCon show. This show is for acquisition pros, wannabe pros, and procurement insiders who need a place to unpack the chaos. We speak fluent contracting and sarcasm. No clearance required. This is the GovCon show. And away we go!
Welcome to the GovCon show, where the federal acquisition regulation meets the real world. I'm your host, Tim Magnuson. This show is for the people who live in the strange intersection between program managers who need solutions yesterday, finance departments or program control who wants cost certainty, legal teams who want risk protection, and auditors who want documentation for everything that happened since 2004. There are certain phrases in government contracting that instantly trigger concern. And one of them for me is, we need to loop contracts in. Not because that phrase sounds harmless. It sounds responsible. It sounds like someone is doing the right thing. But it's the timing of that phrase that really matters. Because when contracts is brought in early, things are usually fine. When contracts is brought in late, that's when things get interesting. That's when the dynamics change. And by interesting, I mean structurally terrifying. Let me paint you a picture. The program team has been working on something for weeks, maybe months. They've had technical discussions. They've talked to suppliers. They've discussed pricing. They've talked about schedules. They've probably made a few promises. And then suddenly, someone realizes something. Wait, shouldn't contracts be involved in this? Yes, they should have been about 3 weeks ago. Now, if you're listening to this and you work in contracts, you probably just nodded your head because you've lived through this. And if you work in program management, you're probably thinking, it's not that bad. Oh, let me assure you, from the contract's perspective, it's exactly that bad, if not worse. There is a very specific moment in these situations. The moment when contracts enters the conversation, and the contracts professional asks the most dangerous question in government contracting. So, what exactly have we already agreed to? And the answers start coming. Well, we told them that the schedule would be 6 months. Well, we said that the data rights shouldn't be a big problem for us. We mentioned that the government probably wouldn't care about the limitations on subcontracting clause. We assumed the pricing structure would work itself out later on. This is the moment where contracts person quietly begins reconstructing the situation, because what they're really doing is assessing 3 things: what commitments have been made, what risks have already been created, and how big that bus is that we hear approaching. Let me give you a real life example on how this happens. I once watched a situation where a program team had spent months negotiating with the supplier. Technical discussions were complete, pricing discussions were complete, everyone was excited. The deal was essentially done. And then someone said, we should probably get contracts to review this agreement. So contracts opens the document, starts reading, and within 2 minutes notices something. The intellectual property clause. 1 sentence, just one. That sentence would have transferred unlimited rights to all proprietary technology that the company had spent years and years developing. The program team had noticed it. The supplier assumed it was acceptable. And unfortunately, the entire agreement stopped instantly. 1 sentence, deal over. That's why contracts exist. Now, this dynamic creates one of the most interesting relationships in government contracting. The relationship between program management and contracts. Because both sides want the same thing: a successful program, but they approach the problem from very different directions. Program managers are focused on execution, schedules, deliveries, performance, customer satisfaction. Contracts is focused on structure, risk allocation, regulatory compliance, terms and conditions, file documentation. Both roles are very essential, but when contracts is brought in late, the 2 perspectives collide. The program team is thinking, well, we already told the customer we could do this. Contracts is thinking, that may violate 3 clauses and create 2 regulatory problems. The program team says, well, we just need to move forward. Contracts' answer is, we need to understand the legal structure before we move forward. That's when the tension begins. Now, if you've ever worked in contracts, you've seen this moment. You say something like, we should probably review the contract language before agreeing to that. And someone says, well, we already told them we would do it. That's the moment every contracts professional internally thinks, here comes the bus. Now, here's the interesting thing. Most of the time, this situation doesn't happen because anyone did something wrong. It happens because of something much simpler. People misunderstand what contracts actually does. Contracts is not there to slow things down. Contract is there to answer one critical question. What exactly did we agree to? Because in government contracting, agreements carry consequences, pricing structures, technical obligations, intellectual property rights, cybersecurity responsibilities, flow-down clauses, regulatory liability. All of those things are hidden inside the words of the contract. And sometimes the most dangerous sentence in an agreement is the one that looks completely harmless. Now this brings us to another interesting part of government contracting. There are three situations where contracts getting looped in late almost always creates drama. First, teaming agreements, because those discussions often begin as technical collaboration. They eventually someone says, well, we should formalize this. And suddenly contracts is reading a document where half of the commitments have already been verbally agreed to. Second is subcontract negotiations. The program team talks to the supplier. They talk about scope, they talk about schedule, they talk about pricing. And then contracts opens the document and asks, wait, who carries the technical risk here? And my third example is customer commitments. Sometimes the government asks for something outside the existing contract structure. Program teams want to help, but contracts has to determine whether the agreement actually allows for it. Because in government contracting, the contract language always wins. Now, let's take a quick detour into something I like to call the far side. These are the rules that only make sense if you worked in this industry long enough. For example, changes. In most industries, if the customer asks for something new, you discuss it and move forward. In government contracting, there's an entire legal structure around what qualifies as a contract change. Scope, authority, equitable adjustments, constructive changes, documentation. You can write an entire legal textbook about this. Which is why contracts people tend to get very nervous when someone casually says, well, the government asked if we could just add one small thing. Because in this world, there is no such thing as one small thing. And at the end of the day, the reason contracts gets pulled into these conversations is simple. Contracts professionals are translators. They translate between the world of execution and the world of regulatory structure. They take complex rules and turn them into agreements that programs can actually perform. And sometimes that means asking uncomfortable questions. So the next time someone says, let's loop contracts in, remember what that really means. It means someone is about to read the agreement, look at the obligations, look at the clauses, look at the risk, and make sure the organization actually understands what it's about to sign. Because in government contract, every contract eventually becomes a story. And contracts professionals are the ones who make sure that that story makes sense. If this episode sounded familiar, yeah, that's because it happens every day. Go ahead and send it to your team, especially the ones who think contracts is something you loop in after the decisions are already made. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this episode with someone who still believes we'll bring contracts in later is a valid strategy. If this is already happening in your organization, you don't need theory, you need to fix it. Until next time, loop contracts in early, read the terms before you agree to them, and maybe, just maybe, bring in the people responsible for compliance before you commit the company. Because if you don't loop contracts in at the beginning, they'll still get involved. Just later, when the deal is signed, and terms are locked, and risk is already moving. And that bus we talked about in the early, yeah, it's not slowing down. It's coming straight for you. And by the time contracts gets pulled in, you're not avoiding it. You're just figuring out how hard it's about to hit. See you next time on the GovCon Show.
If today's episode sounded a little too familiar, that's probably a sign. Until next time, keep your files tight, your logic tighter. Remember, if your compliance approach is built on checking boxes, you're building risk. We'll see you next time on the GovCon show.
This broadcast has been cleared for public release, but just barely.